on the 8th of October 1905, in a small Russian Orthodox chapel inside a private house in Tegernsee, Bavaria, a 28-year-old woman married a man the Tsar of Russia had expressly forbidden her to marry. There was no permission from the Russian court. There was no blessing from the Orthodox Church, which considered the union between first cousins something close to incest. There was, in fact, almost no one in either of their families who wanted this marriage to happen at all. The bride did not even share her groom's religion and had no plans to convert. And yet she stood there anyway, in a borrowed chapel in a foreign country, and married him. Within weeks, the Tsar would strip her new husband of his rank, his income, and his uniform, and order them both out of Russia. This is the story of Victoria Melita of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, twice a Grand Duchess, twice married to her own first cousins, and the woman who chose exile over obedience, not once, but as a matter of principle, for the rest of her life. The Welcome to Crown Files. She was born on the 25th of November, 1876, at San Anton Palace on the island of Malta, where her father, Prince Alfred, was stationed as an officer of the Royal Navy. Alfred was the second son of Queen Victoria, a sailor prince who had spent more of his life on ships than in palaces, and so his daughter's middle name was chosen for the place of her birth, Melita, the old Latin word for Malta. Her mother was Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna, the only surviving daughter of Tsar Alexander II of Russia, a woman who had grown up amid the gold and malachite of the Winter Palace and who never quite adjusted to the comparative modesty of English royal life. The marriage of Alfred and Maria had itself been arranged across an ocean of mutual suspicion. The British court considered the Romanovs extravagant and untrustworthy. The Russian court considered the British court provincial and stiff. And the child born of that uneasy alliance would spend her whole life caught between the two empires that had produced her. The family called her Ducky. Nobody recorded with certainty why. Some said it was a mangled toddler's pronunciation of Victoria. Others simply that it suited her from the start. But the name stuck for the whole of her life, used by her sisters, her cousins, even by monarchs, long after she had become a Grand Duchess in her own right. She was the third child and second daughter, born into a household that moved between the chill formality of England and the gilded provincialism of her father's eventual inheritance. When she was 3, the family relocated again, this time to the small German duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, of which her father stood in line to become reigning duke. Coburg, a town of red rooftops and provincial dignity, the ancestral seat of the family that had given Queen Victoria her own beloved husband, Albert. By 1893, Alfred had succeeded to the dukedom, and the family's life folded fully into the rhythms of a small German court. Shooting parties, music lessons, French and German tutors, a household run on royal protocol despite a budget far smaller than the public imagined. The duchy itself was modest by the standards of the great European powers, a territory measured in square miles rather than provinces, its court a fraction the size of the Russian or British ones. Ducky's parents had each, in their own way, left behind, and growing up inside it meant absorbing 2 competing lessons at once: that her family's blood entitled her to the very grandest marriages Europe could offer, and that the actual household she lived in was, by royal standards, almost humble. Ducky was, by every account that survives her, a complicated child to raise. where her older sister Marie was blonde, easy and instinctively charming. The kind of girl who could walk into any room in Europe and be liked within minutes. Ducky was dark-haired, serious, and quick to take offence. She had, her sister Marie wrote of her, a passionate temperament that the adults around her consistently misunderstood, mistaking intensity for sullenness and pride for coldness. She painted, she played piano with real skill. She rode horses with an ease that made grown men nervous to watch. And although she was younger than Marie by a year, she stood taller and seemed, in nearly every photograph, to be the elder of the two. A girl who carried herself like she already knew what was coming and had decided not to be afraid of it. What was expected of her was never in doubt. She was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, which made her, in the candid language of the era, a piece on a chessboard, a future bride, whose marriage would be selected not for affection, but for alliance, a dynastic instrument to bind one royal house to another. Her grandmother took a personal, almost obsessive interest in arranging the marriages of her grandchildren, treating the matter with the seriousness of a foreign policy. Ducky understood this from childhood, the way other children understand gravity, not as an injustice to be fought, simply as the shape of the world. There was one detail from those early years, though, that would follow her for the rest of her life and return again and again at the turning points of her story. A small, heavy ring of Russian gold, a piece of her mother's jewellery that Ducky was given as a girl, etched with a date in the old Russian calendar. She wore it, lost it, found it, and wore it again, across 2 marriages, 2 countries, and 2 revolutions. It was, in its way, the only constant she ever fully chose to keep. In the autumn of 1891, when Ducky was 14, she travelled with her mother to Russia for the funeral of a relative. Grand Duchess Alexandra Georgievna, the young wife of her mother's brother, who had died suddenly and far too young. Funerals in royal Europe were, paradoxically, among the great social gatherings of the age. Half of the continent's ruling houses crowded into a single city for a few days of mourning, surrounded by black crepe and gossip. It was there that Ducky first properly met her first cousin, Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich, the second son of Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich. He was exactly 1 month older than she was. He was tall, fair, and possessed of an easy military bearing. An officer already, comfortable in uniform, comfortable in rooms full of strangers in a way Ducky had never quite managed to be. Where she was guarded, he was direct. Where she measured every word, he simply said what he thought. They were opposites in nearly every visible way, and within days of meeting, they were inseparable. It would be wrong to call what happened between them simply a flirtation. By every account, her own later writing, her sister's memoirs, the recollections of relatives who watched it happen. The 2 cousins fell in love that autumn with the complete, unembarrassed seriousness that only teenagers can manage, and then spent the better part of 2 years writing to each other across the breadth of Europe, certain that the strength of the feeling would eventually be enough. It would not be. There were 2 separate walls standing between them, and either one alone might have been survivable. But together they were close to absolute. The first was Ducky's own mother, who had no intention of watching another daughter married into the Romanov family. Her own marriage into a half-British, half-German household had not made her affectionate toward the Russian court. And she was, by her daughter's account, deeply wary of the temperaments of the men in her birth family. The second wall was older and harder than any single mother's reluctance. The Russian Orthodox Church forbade marriage between first cousins outright. For Kirill to marry Ducky as things stood was not merely inadvisable. It was, under the law of his own church, impossible. And so, while Ducky and Kirill kept writing to each other in the vain hope that the impossible would somehow resolve itself, Queen Victoria had already begun building the more practical solution. In the autumn of 1889, while Ducky was visiting her grandmother at Clarence House, the Queen had taken note of the easy rapport between her granddaughter and another cousin who happened to be visiting at the same time, Ernst Ludwig, Prince of Hesse, and by Rhine, known to the family as Ernie. The two were almost suspiciously well matched on paper. The same artistic temperament, a shared fondness for music and theatre, and, in the kind of detail that delighted Victorian matchmakers, the very same birthday. The Queen decided, with the quiet, irreversible authority of a woman who had been arranging her family's marriages for half a century, that this was the match. What she did not notice, or did not choose to notice, was that the rapport she'd observed across a drawing room was not the same thing as compatibility across a marriage, and that her granddaughter's heart had already been given elsewhere, 2 years before the wedding was ever proposed. Ernst Ludwig, when he is described honestly by the people who knew him, comes across as a man of real artistic sensitivity, wrapped inside a temperament that those closest to him called sullen and at times openly querulous. He loved architecture, design, the visual arts. He would later remake the city of Darmstadt into one of the great centres of the European Art Nouveau movement. But he was also a man uncomfortable in his own private life, given to moods that left a wife wondering, at any given hour, which version of him she would meet. Ducky, 17 years old, and still privately writing letters to a cousin in Russia she had not seen in 3 years, was told this was the marriage that had been arranged for her, and on the 9th of April, 1894, in the chapel of Schloss Ehrenburg in Coburg, she obeyed. The wedding itself was, by the standards of the era, a triumph of royal staging. Gathered cousins from 3 empires, a chapel glittering with court dress, a bride universally agreed to be one of the most striking young women in Europe. What almost none of the guests in that chapel knew was that the bride had spent the morning of her own wedding in tears, and that the groom standing beside her would, within a few short years, become a man she could barely tolerate sharing a house with. The marriage cracked almost immediately in the quiet, undramatic way that arranged marriages between fundamentally mismatched people tend to crack, not through any single scandal, but through years of slowly accumulating distance. Ducky and Ernie, by the testimony of nearly everyone around them, simply did not get along. She was strong-willed and direct in the way her mother's family had always been. He was withdrawn, moody, prone to long silences that Ducky read as rejection, and he likely experienced as something closer to private suffering. They produced one child, a daughter named Elizabeth, born in 1895, doted on by both parents in the rare moments their attentions aligned. But the marriage itself settled, within a handful of years, into something closer to a cohabitation of strangers, 2 people sharing a grand duchy, a household and a child, while living, in every way that mattered, almost entirely separate lives. Darmstadt, where the young couple kept their principal household, was at the time becoming one of the most artistically ambitious courts in Germany. Ernst Ludwig was pouring money and energy into transforming the city. Commissioning architects, founding an artists' colony on the Mathildenhöhe hill, surrounding himself with painters and designers in a way that made Darmstadt, briefly, a genuine centre of the European Art Nouveau movement. Ducky shared his artistic instincts, and in another life, with another husband, this shared sensibility might have been the foundation of a real partnership. Instead, it became one more space in which they worked separately. The same city, often in the same rooms, without managing to meet. Visitors to the Hesse court in those years described an atmosphere of glittering, almost theatrical hospitality on the surface, and a chill underneath it that the guests were not meant to notice, and mostly did. For 7 years, Ducky remained inside that marriage, a young Grand Duchess performing the rituals of a role she had never asked for. The daily texture of that endurance left little trace in any official record, because it was not the kind of thing royal households committed to paper. There were no scandal sheet headlines for a marriage that simply went quiet, no single incident a biographer could point to and say, "Here, this is where it broke." What survives instead is the shape of an absence. Years in which Ducky hosted, attended, smiling for photographers, raising her daughter, and privately growing more and more certain that she could not spend the rest of her life this way. The European courts at the turn of the century were not gentle toward unhappy wives. Divorce, for a woman of royal blood, was considered something close to social suicide. An admission that carried more shame in the eyes of polite society than almost any other failure a princess could commit. Death, more than one observer of the era noted with a kind of grim accuracy, was sometimes considered the more dignified outcome, since a dead wife required no explanation and a divorced one required years of them. And so for years, Ducky did what was expected. She endured. She hosted Ernie's friends. She managed his moods, learning, the way people in difficult marriages do, to read a room before she'd even fully entered it. She kept the small Russian ring from her childhood close, a private thread back to a version of herself that had once believed love and duty might be the same thing. Worn quietly under gloves at the very dinners where she was performing, for an audience of her own relatives, the picture of a contented young Grand Duchess. The breaking point, when it finally came, was not subtle. The precise details of what passed between Ernst Ludwig and Victoria in the final stretch of their marriage have never been fully and publicly settled. The historical record leaves the exact nature of the final rupture deliberately vague, the way most royal divorces of the era were kept vague, with both families working hard to control what the newspapers were permitted to know. What is documented is the outcome. Ernst Ludwig, in language preserved by one of the family's later chroniclers, behaved so badly toward his wife that she left their household for good, and this time she did not return. In 1901, Victoria Melita did what almost no woman of her rank had done in living memory. She filed for divorce, and she won it. The scandal that followed was immediate and considerable. A princess of the blood, divorced and living independently, was treated across Europe's royal courts as something between a tragedy and a disgrace, and Ducky absorbed every ounce of that judgment, publicly while privately, for the first time in a decade, beginning to feel something close to her own life returning to her. There was, however, a wound buried inside the years that followed that no scandal, however loud, could touch. In 1903, 2 years after the divorce, her young daughter Elizabeth, the one unambiguous joy of the entire Hesse marriage, died suddenly of typhoid fever while visiting her father in Russia. She was 8 years old. Ducky, who had already lost a marriage and a great deal of her public standing, now lost the one thing the marriage had given her that she had never regretted. There is no record of her speaking publicly about this loss in any detail. The silence itself, in a woman otherwise known for plain speech, says something the historical record cannot. It was into this landscape of loss and disgrace that Kirill reappeared. Not as a sudden romantic intervention, but as the steady continuation of something that had, in truth, never actually ended. The two cousins had stayed loosely in contact across the years of her first marriage, and now, both of them older, both of them aware of exactly what defying their families would cost, they made the decision together. The obstacles that had separated them as teenagers had not gone away. The Orthodox Church still forbade marriage between first cousins. Tsar Nicholas II, who held the legal power to override that prohibition under Russia's fundamental laws. Russian emperors had granted such dispensations before for more distant cousins, made it clear, repeatedly, that he would not grant one now. He had been openly displeased by the publicity surrounding Ducky's divorce, and he had no intention of allowing a member of the Romanov family to marry a divorced woman, however royal her blood. Even King Edward VII, Ducky's own uncle, is recorded as having personally appealed to Nicholas on her behalf, a rare instance of one reigning monarch lobbying another over a private family matter, and even that appeal changed nothing. So Kirill and Ducky made the only choice left available to them. They married anyway, without permission, in a private Orthodox chapel attached to the home of Count Adlerberg in Tegernsee, a small Bavarian lake town chosen precisely because it sat outside the reach of the Russian court's ordinary surveillance. There was no grand assembly of European royalty this time, no chapel glittering with the dress uniforms of 3 empires. The ceremony was small, hurried in the way that ceremonies are hurried, when the people inside them know that delay only invites intervention, and quietly defiant, in a way the earlier wedding at Schloss Ehrenburg, for all its splendor, had never been. Ducky wore, by her own choice and not her family's, no Orthodox conversion to mark the occasion. She stood in that chapel, still a Protestant, still under her own terms, and would not formally join the Russian Church for nearly 2 more years. It was a ceremony built almost entirely out of 2 people's insistence that it happen, with the rest of the apparatus of family and faith assembled around them. Only because the law of the Church technically required a building with an altar in it. It was an act that announced, more clearly than any letter or speech could have, where the 2 of them now believed power actually lived. Not in the offices and titles their families could grant or withhold, but in the simple, stubborn fact of a decision 2 people had made about their own lives and refused to unmake. The retaliation, when it came, was swift and total. Word reached Kirill's father within days. Tsar Nicholas, upon Kirill's return to Russia, stripped him of his imperial allowance of 100,000 rubles a year, removed his title of Imperial Highness, revoked his honors and decorations, and dismissed him from his commission in the Imperial Navy. Then he banished the couple from Russia altogether. The reaction from inside Kirill's own family was, if anything, more painful than the Tsar's official punishment. His mother, the formidable Grand Duchess Vladimir, was reportedly furious. But the deepest and most lasting fury came from a woman who had once been Ducky's own sister-in-law, Empress Alexandra of Russia, who, as Princess Alix of Hesse, had been Ernst Ludwig's sister, and who had never warmed to Ducky even during the years of the Hesse marriage. Now, with her brother humiliated by a divorce and a former sister-in-law remarrying into the very family that ruled the empire she presided over, Alexandra's resentment burned without restraint. She is recorded as having said she would not receive a woman who had behaved so disgracefully, and that she never wanted to see her again. For a brief but very real period, the most powerful woman in Russia and the woman who had just married into the senior branch of the Romanov family were locked in a private, bitter estrangement that mirrored, almost exactly, the institutional rejection coming from the church and the throne above them both. Banished and stripped of income, Kirill and Ducky settled in Paris, building a small household out of what remained of their reduced circumstances. Gone were the household staffs, the court allowances, the apartments measured by the dozens of rooms that had defined Ducky's entire life until that point. In their place came a rented house, a markedly smaller domestic staff, and the unfamiliar daily arithmetic of a family living within an actual budget rather than an inherited one. It was here, away from the immense weight of the Russian court, that the two of them lived for several years as something closer to ordinary people than either had ever been permitted to be. A Grand Duke without his fortune, a former Grand Duchess of Hesse, now simply a wife in exile, raising two young daughters, Maria, born in 1907, and Kira, born in 1909, in rented rooms instead of palaces. There is a particular kind of irony worth sitting with here, that the years Ducky later described, in fragments preserved by her family, as among the most genuinely contented of her adult life, were also the years in which she possessed the least status, the least security, and the least of what her birth had promised her. The smallness of that life in Paris, the budgeting, the absence of court ceremony, the daily unspectacular intimacy of raising children with a husband she had actually chosen, gave her something the grandest palace of her childhood never had. It would be a mistake, however, to read those Paris years as simple happiness, uncomplicated by anything else. Exile, even comfortable exile, carries its own slow erosion. Letters from family members were guarded and occasional. News from Russia arrived late and filtered through gossip. And there remained underneath the domestic calm a persistent and humiliating uncertainty about whether either of them would ever be permitted to go home, in any sense of the word, again. Ducky kept, through these years, the small gold ring from her childhood, the one piece of her old Russian inheritance that had survived 2 marriages and 2 scandals intact, and she wore it, by the account of those close to her, almost without exception, as if it were the one part of her identity that no Tsar, no church, and no mother-in-law could strip from her by decree. The thaw, when it eventually arrived, came not from sentiment, but from the same cold calculation of royal politics that had caused the rupture in the first place. By 1909, the Russian court's position had softened, partly through the passage of time, partly through the quiet diplomatic efforts of relatives on both sides, and partly, Historians have suggested, through Nicholas's own recognition, that punishing his cousin indefinitely served the dynasty no real purpose. The couple was permitted to visit Russia that year, and by 1910 they had moved there permanently. Nicholas formally recognized Victoria as Grand Duchess Victoria Fyodorovna, restoring to her, in title at least, everything that had been taken away 5 years earlier. She had by then already converted to Orthodoxy, completing in 1907 the religious transformation she had explicitly refused to make at the time of her wedding. A final, telling detail: she would not convert under compulsion, as the price of being permitted to marry, but she would convert in her own time, once the marriage itself was no longer in question. It was a small but precise distinction, and entirely in character. The years that followed brought Ducky back into the orbit of the very court that had once exiled her, though never entirely back into its favour. She and Kirill took up residence in St. Petersburg, building a household that was, by every account, genuinely happy. A marriage of mutual choice, now finally permitted to function as an ordinary marriage, in an imperial capital that had spent 2 decades treating her as an outsider. But the wider story of Europe, by this point, was beginning to close in on every royal house on the continent, Ducky's included. Russia, in the years before the war, was a country straining visibly at its own seams. A population increasingly restless under autocratic rule, a series of failed reforms following the 1905 revolution that Nicholas II had only barely survived, and a court that continued, even as the ground shifted beneath it, to conduct its business with the unhurried formality of a much more stable century. Ducky, who had spent her adolescence learning the rules of that formality, and her 20s being punished for breaking them, now watched the entire system she had fought so hard to be readmitted to begin, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to come apart. The First World War arrived in 1914, drawing Kirill into active military service. He would rise to the rank of Rear Admiral in the Imperial Navy and take command of the Naval Guard's depot. While Ducky, like so many royal women of her generation, found her private world increasingly inseparable from the convulsions of empire. She spent the war years, as many of her female relatives did, organizing hospital wards and nursing units for wounded soldiers. The practical domestic skills of a lifetime spent managing households now turned toward the considerably less ceremonial work of bandages and infirmary supply lines. The Romanov dynasty she had married into, against every obstacle its own rules could throw in her path, was now only a few years from collapse. And the woman who had once been banished from Russia for marrying into that family would soon watch the family itself banished from history altogether. When the February Revolution broke out in 1917, it placed Kirill in a position that would haunt his reputation for the rest of his life and beyond it. In a moment whose full context historians still debate, Kirill marched his Naval Guard contingent to the Tauride Palace and swore an oath of allegiance to the new provisional government. An act some defenders later framed as a pragmatic attempt to protect his men and his family amid collapsing order, and which critics saw as an unforgivable abandonment of the dynasty in its hour of greatest need. Whatever the truth of his motives, the practical consequence for Ducky was immediate and dangerous. By the summer of 1917, with revolutionary fervor intensifying and the position of any Romanov in Russia growing more perilous by the week, Kirill fled to Finland, then still nominally part of the Russian state, and Ducky, heavily pregnant, followed him there. It was in Finland in August of 1917 that she gave birth to their only son, Vladimir Kirillovich, a child born into a family with a crown, but for the first time in 3 generations, no actual throne behind it. The years in Finland that followed were not the romanticized hardship that royal exile sometimes becomes in retrospect. They were, by every surviving account, genuinely difficult and genuinely dangerous. The family lived for an extended period in real uncertainty, cut off from most of their relatives, watching from the edges as the empire that had once banished them for love now consumed itself in revolution and civil war. Word reached them, in pieces, of what had happened to the family Kirill had once sworn loyalty to a government within. The murder of Nicholas II and his family at Yekaterinburg, the systematic killing of Romanov after Romanov, as the new Soviet state worked to extinguish the dynasty entirely. Ducky, who had spent her whole adult life navigating the rigid hierarchies and rivalries of that family, now watched most of it disappear within the span of little more than a year. In the wake of that destruction, the family settled into a longer exile, years spent first among relatives in Germany, and eventually, from the late 1920s, on a modest estate the family purchased at Saint-Briac in Brittany, on the French coast. It was a life built once again around reduced means and a household far smaller than the one Ducky had been born into, though never as financially constrained as the early Paris years had once been. And it was here, in 1924, that Kirill made the decision that would define the remainder of both their lives. Believing himself, by the rules of dynastic succession, the senior surviving male of the House of Monov, he proclaimed himself head of the imperial House of Russia, and 2 years later, in 1926, declared himself Emperor of Russia in exile. There was no throne to sit on, no empire left to rule, and a considerable number of surviving relatives who disputed his claim outright. Ducky, who had spent 30 years proving she would not be told who to love, now spent her final years quietly, loyally, supporting her husband's claim to a crown that existed, in the end almost entirely on paper. There is a particular kind of dignity and a particular kind of sorrow in watching someone build an entire second act of their life, defending the legitimacy of something the rest of the world has already stopped believing in. Ducky did not publicly question her husband's claim, and there is no record of her expressing private doubt about it either. She took on, in those final years, much of the practical work such a claim required. Receiving the dwindling circle of monarchists and exiled Russian officers, who still treated Kirill's title as meaningful, the maintaining correspondence with relatives scattered across a dozen countries, holding together the threads of a court that existed almost entirely in the form of letters and visiting cards. It was, in its way, the same skill set she had spent her whole life developing: the management of a household, the performance of dignity under reduced circumstances, turned now toward defending a throne instead of merely occupying one. What the record does show, in the final years of her life, is a woman who had narrowed her focus almost entirely to the small remaining circle of people she had left. Her husband, above all her sister Marie, who had become Queen of Romania, and who remained across every upheaval of both their lives, the one relationship Ducky never had to fight for. The two sisters, so different in temperament since childhood, had stayed close through every divorce, every exile, every revolution, in a bond that neither church law nor royal politics had ever managed to touch. Kirill's own fidelity, meanwhile, had not survived the long years of exile intact. The marriage that had cost them both so much to begin had, by the 1930s, settled into its own quiet disappointments. A husband whose attentions had wandered, and a wife who noticed, in the particular way that women who have already given up everything once tend to notice the second time. February of 1936, Ducky travelled to attend the christening of her sister Marie's fifth grandchild. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary family gathering, the kind of small domestic ceremony that royal families, even reduced ones, still observed out of habit and affection. Shortly after returning home, she suffered a severe stroke that confined her to bed for the final month of her life. Her children gathered around her. Her sister Marie came to sit at her bedside. The same closeness that had carried them both through 5 decades of upheaval, now carrying Ducky through her final weeks. Kirill, by contrast, is recorded by those present as someone Ducky physically recoiled from. In those last days, his own infidelities during the marriage had, by this point, left a wound that even imminent death did not soften. On the 2nd of March 1936, at the small Bavarian town of Amorbach, Victoria Melita of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha died. She was 59 years old. She was buried first in the family mausoleum at Coburg, in the duchy, where she had spent so much of her childhood, among the Saxe-Coburg relatives whose expectations had shaped the first half of her life. It would be nearly 60 years before her remains made the journey her husband's claim had always insisted was rightfully hers. In 1995, long after the fall of the very Soviet state that had destroyed the empire she married into, Victoria Melita's remains were moved to the Grand Ducal Mausoleum at the Peter and Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg, laid finally in Russian soil, among the Romanovs, whose family had once stripped her husband of his title for marrying her. Her legacy did not end with her own life. Her grandson and great-grandchildren would go on to inherit and contest the very claims Kirill had spent his exile defending. The question of who, if anyone, legitimately leads the House of Romanov, still debated by genealogists and monarchists today. That the part of her story that has outlasted the dynastic arguments is not the question of thrones. It is the simpler, harder fact of a woman who was told, twice, who she was permitted to love, and who decided, both times, first by enduring an unhappy marriage out of duty, and then by refusing to endure a second one, that her own judgment about her own life mattered more than the judgment of the people who held the power to punish her for it. There is a question every life like this eventually asks, whether anyone ever says it aloud or not. What is actually being protected when families and churches and empires spend so much energy forbidding two people from choosing each other? It is never really about the two people. It is about what their choice reveals. That the rules holding the whole structure together are, in the end, only as strong as people's willingness to obey them, and that obedience, once broken in one corner, has a way of showing everyone watching exactly how breakable the rest of it always was. What Ducky's life shows us is not that love conquers every obstacle placed in front of it. Her own story is too honest, too full of real cost, real loss, and a real, lonely exile to support so simple a moral. It shows us something closer to the truth, that the price of choosing yourself is real, and she paid it in full, in banishment, in scandal, in the loss of a child, in the slow erosion of a marriage that ultimately disappointed her in its own way too. And she paid it anyway, because the alternative, a lifetime spent inside choices that were never hers, was a debt she had already tried paying once, and found she could not afford a second time. She kept to the very end the small ring of Russian gold she had carried since girlhood. Through one wedding she did not want, through a divorce that scandalized a continent, through a second wedding, conducted in defiance of a Tsar, through exile, through the death of an empire and the death of a child, through every room a powerful family ever tried to lock her out of. It was never the largest jewel she owned, and it was never the most valuable. It was simply the one thing that had always unambiguously belonged to her, and not to anyone who believed they had the right to decide her life for her. She was exiled for choosing him. In the end, it was the only choice of her life she never had to defend to anyone, least of all herself. If you'd like more stories of the women history tried to write out of power, consider subscribing to Crown Files.